Yeah, hello everyone. Very good evening, very good afternoon, or very good morning from wherever that you are. I'm Amer. I'm going to host our event for today. Welcome to the BERA CCEAM lecture series. We value our partnership with BERA in organizing this talk to both BERA and as well as CCEAM members. I am here representing CCEAM as one of the CCEAM executive members. As you are all aware, CCEAM is the Commonwealth Council for Educational Administration and Management, with members from across the globe. We have fleet members from Asia, the Caribbean, the Americas, East and West Africa, as well as Europe. I am actually from Malaysia, representing the Malaysian Society for Educational Administration and Management. Today, we are going to listen to Professor Dr. Carolyn M. Sales. She is a professor at Wayne State University in the USA. Carolyn is also the president for the CCEAM. Carolyn is going to speak to us on a courageous approach to educational leadership for complex and challenging times. Without further ado, Carolyn, I'll pass over the floor to you.
Thank you, Amer. I'm hoping that people can hear me.
Yes, we do.
Thank you. I first want to thank both BERA and CCEAM for the opportunity to deliver this address. It truly is an honor, and I thank Amer for his introduction. I've entitled this talk, A Courageous Approach to Educational Leadership for Complex and Challenging Times, because I'm convinced that leaders need courage to stand up to the many forces arguing about what should be done to improve education in these times. I'm not going to provide a history of the educational leadership research done by our respective organizations, or a history of what has been published in the most prestigious journals. Instead, I'm going to jump into the fray by assuming today's challenges and complexity, and then advocating some approaches to leadership which I think may best address them. I'm going to argue that although there is no one best way, some ways are certainly better than others, and that these are the leadership approaches that foreground the values of equity, inclusion, justice, and excellence. To guide our thinking during the next 50 minutes or so, and I will leave lots of time for questions, Then I'm going to discuss why we ought to take seriously the most recent United Nations education goal. And in the preponderance of this talk, I'm going to examine the theories that have the potential to advance this goal. I start by looking at the context and using a phrase that was first popularized by two people you know, two economists who were also educators, Bennis and Nannis, who asserted in 1987 that we live in a VUCA world. The term VUCA was then popularized by the US military in the 1990s and refers to the fact that our world is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And there's little doubt that this applies to the world of education and the work of educational leaders. Our world is volatile. Changes are unpredictable and beyond our control. We don't always know the sources or the amounts of funding we will deal with. We don't know what policies will guide our work tomorrow, nor what constraints will be placed on us. In the United States, 7 states recently have banned what they call critical race theory, with another 16 having bills moving through the legislature. This means that teachers who talk about slavery or any racial history or topic are in serious danger of dismissal. Only Delaware has introduced a bill that affirms the goal of teaching about the effect that slavery has had on generations of minorities in the United States. In the UK, as you know, there's been a plethora of recent reforms, including national curriculum, various accountability plans, increased parental choice, and so on. Our world is uncertain. We must act without certain knowledge. We don't know from one day to the next how many qualified teachers will be available. We're uncertain about how many students will register, who they'll be, what languages they speak, even whether they've previously been to school. It's becoming nearly impossible to plan for the next year. And our world is complex. We know that there are many different forces that interconnect and intermingle. Curriculum, human relations, facility improvement, finances, all are dependent on many forces, including policy, community cultures, powerful individuals, lots of money, etc. How can we make decisions about a desirable path? And our world is ambiguous. Much is unfamiliar and beyond our expertise. And there is no longer, if there ever was, an appropriate one-size-fits-all of leadership. The term best practice has been, or at least should have been, relegated to the trash heap, or at least strongly modified by asking best practice for whom, where, when, and under what circumstances. And so educational researchers and leaders in today's VUCA times must ask themselves whether there are any reliable guideposts or theories to inform their work. And in some ways, that's where the United Nations comes in. Article 26 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has a right to education. And for many years, the United Nations has been making proclamations and identifying goals intended to fulfill that statement. In 1989, all but 2 nations ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And in 2000, the Millennium Goal advocated universal primary education by 2005. This was later extended to 2010 and then to 2015, but it was never reached because over 75 million children were still denied that right. Undaunted, at the UN meeting in Incheon, Korea, 160 nations, in other words, all of the countries of those of us who are here today, signed on to 17 interconnected sustainable development goals. A collection of goals intended to, quote, end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that by 2030, all people enjoy peace and prosperity. The fourth of these goals is the education goal, to ensure inclusive, equitable, quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. The education goal is supplemented by 10 specific targets, such as by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes, unquote. And so I think we need to ask, what are we doing about this? What plans do we have? And what kind of progress are we making? We know in 2022, we're still far from attaining goal 4, and the recent COVID pandemic has deepened the crisis. 57 million primary-age children still remain out of school. In developing countries, 1 in 4 girls is not in school. About half of all out-of-school children live in conflict areas. And even if they are in school, over 103 million youth lack basic skills in math and reading. And I think you'll agree that these are truly abysmal statistics. But the question really is, should we care about this? Sometimes we think it just happens on the other side of the world. And if we should care, why should we care? And I'd like you just to take a couple of minutes to jot your answers or some thoughts in the chat. Why should we care? I'm waiting for some answers. One person says we're part of the society, we have to advocate for it. Caring is what makes us human. It's a human rights issue. Rose in 2021 argued that the most striking feature of global interaction is that a significant development in one place is likely to set off a complex chain reaction, disrupting and rearranging numerous relationships over an extensive area, maybe even around the whole world. We should care because we live in an interconnected world. So let's go back to VUCA. Our world is not only volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, but it's interconnected. Truly a global village. Gas or petrol prices throughout the world are affected by a decision made in Saudi Arabia. 14% of the UK's population, 232 million people, were born outside their country of birth. And that comprises a significant economic and capital power. In Canada, the percent's even higher. 22% claim to be immigrants. A supermarket in the UK or the US may raise the price of coffee because of a weather incident in Brazil. Stop and look at the tags on your clothing. Where are they made? Who made them? And under what conditions? And some of the children who are out of school will be part of displacement and the new diaspora and will make their way into our countries. And some of us will teach them. But the question still is how? What kind of pedagogy? What kind of leadership will succeed? What are we doing as educators to ensure that students from all parts of the world who come into our schools are fully included and respected in an equitable and high quality education? And so I move to the major part of this address. What theories and approaches can help to attain this goal? Here I will suggest specifically how some approaches are failing, as well as posit ways to achieve the goal. Some scholars talk about a new VUCA, and that may be helpful. Instead of talking about volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, they talk about vision, understanding, clarity, and agility. And we know that many leadership theories talk about vision. Some would call for shared vision, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Understanding requires knowing ourselves, our organizations, and our communities. Not just in general, but the many specific groups and organizations that make up our community. And I need to say, this does not mean that we should be able to teach about every single one of them, but we do need to respect them and honor them and listen to them and learn from them. Clarity, again, means knowing who we are, what are our challenges, what inequities exist in our organizations, what are we willing to do about the situation. And this is important because we know there will be pushback from some of the traditionally powerful individuals or groups. Agility suggests that we need some bedrock principles, but not prescriptions. We need to be able to adapt and change as our circumstances change. We can't do that if we're rigidly following a map. And so I would suggest the following. We need a leadership theory that helps us to advance the Sustainable Development Goal 4. It must clarify the components of inclusion, equity, high quality, justice, and reflect on how to offer opportunities for lifelong learning to all students. This focus on the marginalized, the oppressed, and the least advantaged will of necessity, I think, lead us to a critical theory of leadership. At the same time, it must be comprehensive, and it's important to recognize that what's good for the least advantaged children will also result in equity and excellence for all. A critical focus does not sacrifice anyone. It doesn't sacrifice quality or excellence, but it provides us new ways forward. We need an educational leadership theory that guides our vision, grounds it in bedrock principles and values in a specific context. I would argue further for a normative theory, one that offers signposts and guidance without being prescriptive, and for a flexible theory that helps us understand not only those organizations as a whole, but the individuals and subgroups that comprise it. We need a theory that compels us to ask, who is included and who's excluded? Who's advantaged and who's disadvantaged? Who's marginalized and who's privileged? Whose voices have been heard and whose have been silenced? And we need to ask this question every time we make a decision or allocate resources. And so where do we look? When we examine any meta-analyses of educational leadership or papers purporting to conduct a thorough review of educational leadership styles or theories or principles, the examination often includes some of these theories, but stops with traditional approaches and particularly ends with transformational leadership. In the UK, for example, a site called Leadership and Management emphasizes processes through which leaders can acquire skills. They also provide numerous links to resources and materials, such as a link called Leadership Styles. And this one identifies the very old and traditional leadership work of Lewin and Blake and Mouton. It ends, as many do, with transformational leadership, and states that it was first developed in 1978 and further developed in 1985. And many articles, and I could cite dozens of them, but we don't have time, do the same. They stop at transformational leadership. Now, I need you to know that I'm not disparaging these more traditional leadership theories. It's really important to know whether to focus on bureaucratic or transactional or transformational leadership. And we know it's vital to set directions and to develop people. But it's also essential to take into consideration the situation. I'm arguing that these theories do not fully address the current VUCA climate, and they certainly do not specifically advance the cause of the Sustainable Development Goal. They don't talk about inclusion, equity, justice, high quality. Typically, these older theories focus on things like traits, as in the great man theory, or processes, as Blake and Mouton. Are they task or people-oriented? Or perhaps even do they have a specific focus, such as instructional leadership? But the point is, there's no moral purpose. We could ask, what's the purpose of instructional leadership? And some might say, to ensure all students pass the test. And others might say, to make sure all students become critical thinkers. But none of it is value-based. And so once again, and I will continue to say this, traditional theories seem to me to be inadequate for a VUCA world. They're not holistic enough. However, I think one of the problems is, and it's a good problem to have, but we need to figure out how to counteract it, that many of the newer theories take seriously that notion of context. They accept the VUCA notion that there's no one best theory. And so they focus on the local, on individual schools, on individual leaders, on what happens to certain groups of students. In fact, in 2002, Ira Bogach put forth a challenge and argued that social justice cannot be separated from the context or the practices of educational leadership. And so one of the problems is that these theories don't use effect sizes or statistical data, and so meta-analyses ignore them. And so it's really important, I think, today to pay attention to these more recent approaches, despite the fact that they take context seriously and focus more on case studies and reports. And so I want us to look at some more recent approaches. We know that by the mid-90s, a few radical scholars, radical obviously in quotation marks, Foster and Smith, for example, had begun to introduce the notion of into educational administration of social justice. By 2006, the Leadership for Social Justice Special Interest Group of the American Education Research Association was formed. And its goal was to find ways to redress the unequal playing field, to create more inclusive and socially just learning environments. However, and I think you'll agree with me, the term social justice quickly became a shifting signifier, and it meant virtually everything and almost nothing. A direct instruction approach may be seen as socially just by Madeline Hunter followers, while a more student-centered approach will be deemed just by others. Leaving the European Union might have been deemed just by some, while many others remaining in the Union would have said that was just. Similarly, in the United States, supporting Donald Trump's wall on the US-Mexican border would be seen to be just by those wanting to restrict immigration and save our country, while others argue for the rights of all to immigration and refuge in safe living conditions. Even though social justice isn't very specific, many leaders talk about social justice leadership. And so in 2007, Theo Harris, somebody that I'm sure many of you quote, wrote about and defined social justice leadership. And he said, these principles make issues of race, class, gender, disability, sexual orientation, and other historically and currently marginalizing conditions central to their advocacy, leadership practice, and vision. And then he continued, and this is what causes me pause. This definition centers on addressing and eliminating marginalization in schools. Now, I think that's a really wonderful start, but I would agree with other scholars like McCutcheon, who said that this is too narrow a definition. And so I wanted a definition that took seriously Oakes and Rogers' notion that the concept isn't and can't be confined to schools, because they say educational equity is entangled with cultural and political dynamics that extend beyond the school. Therefore, equity reformers must engage issues of power by extending beyond the school. I think that's obvious in today's society. And one example is that in the United States, state legislatures need to be considered, because as they're forbidding teachers to talk about race, they're also banning books like the Harry Potter series of Mice and Men or To Kill a Mockingbird. And so I then looked at culturally relevant or responsive school leadership. And I was surprised to see in 2016 that Khalifa said, this theory focuses specifically on behaviors. And Ladson-Billing focuses it particularly on pedagogy. There's no discussion of issues like power and privilege. And yet, Khalifa says that culturally relevant school leadership encompasses other forms of leadership like anti-oppressive, transformative, and social justice leadership. I don't think it does. I wanted a leadership theory that went beyond the school, that addressed beliefs as well as behaviors, and one that was educational, but could also be used in other disciplines. And so I turned to the work of James McGregor Burns, who wrote the book Leadership in 1978. He asserted at the time that transactional leadership was the norm, but that what we need is something called transforming leadership. And this has caused a little bit of confusion because both transformational and transformative leadership have emerged from this notion. But I want to see what Burns' intent was, so I looked carefully. And in 1978, he said that although revolutionary leadership was rare, revolution is a complete and pervasive transformation of an entire social system, one that transforms society, including reconstruction of the economy, education, communications, law, and medicine. And later, he talked about the importance of purpose, as well as the need to investigate the extent of real change in the lives of people. Later in 2003, Burns argued that leadership is a moral undertaking whose greatest task must be to respond to the billions of the world people in direct want. And I think that these ideas of moral and purposeful leadership that address those who most need change are central to his thinking, and therefore I think he really would prefer transformative leadership. I don't think earlier forms of transformational leadership or other earlier leadership theories are adequate to today's world. They identify tasks to be undertaken, setting directions, developing people, and so forth, but they don't indicate a moral purpose. They're not specifically focused on equity. And so even as I was reading these theories and teaching them, I struggled to find them complete enough to satisfy me. Then I read an article by Quantz, Rogers, and Dantley, written in 1991, which begins American schools are in a period of confusion. And of course, they still are. But they continue, of the commonly discussed theories, only the concept of transformative leadership appears to provide an appropriate direction. And even here, they say the literature lacks a clear enough vision for understanding the present political and moral issues. Now, I need to say, even as I was trying to help provide that clear vision, I'm totally frustrated when I Google or use YouTube and ask for articles or videos about transformative leadership. So one day I asked Google, what's the difference between transformative and transformational? And here's the answer I got. Transactional is, and transformational is. Even Google totally ignored transformative. And part of the problem is that transformative and transformational are often used as synonyms. They both come from the old French verb transformer and the Latin transformare, each meaning to change something. But when you go to the dictionary, WikiDiff or Merriam-Webster's dictionary, they differentiate between the two. They say that transformative has the power to transform, modify, alter something into something else, while transformational is relating to, characterized by, pertaining to transformation. So transformative is indicative of agency and action and activism, and transformational describes the outcomes of each activity. I think that definition is important, even though in early educational literature of the 20th century, scholars used both terms. Even the article by Quantz, Rogers, and Dantley used both terms a couple of times. And often we use transformative or transformational without any reference at all to specific theories. Recently, however, in educational leadership literature, there's been a lot of awareness of the differentiation. 10 years ago, 11 years ago, almost 12, Blackmore said, transformational leadership has been framed narrowly within the school effectiveness improvement paradigms, while transformative leadership discourses derive from a critical tradition promoting emancipatory pedagogies. The same year, Starrett said, these are names I'm sure you know, the distinction between transformational and transformative leadership is an important one, not only for the field of education, but also for leadership theory and research in other fields. And 2 years later, Van Ord summed up the situation. He stated of transformative leadership that the term is not new, and said for many years the concepts of transformational and transformative leadership were used as synonyms, as I just said. And he added, recognizing this conceptual murkiness, scholars such as Shields have in recent years successfully endeavored to define and theorize transformative leadership as distinctively separate from the transformational approach. And he rightly said, transformative leadership is characterized by its activist agenda and its overriding commitment to social justice, equality, and a democratic society. And so I read and I reread a whole myriad of articles using the term transformative leadership, starting with that one by Quantz, Rogers, and Dantley. And I determined to do what they said needed to be done to clarify and articulate the concept so it provided a vision for the future. I started with the understanding that a theory, even for a qualitative researcher, should include variables or items that may be manipulated and assessed, and I won't use the term tested. So based on all my reading, I identified 2 hypotheses or principles that guide transformative leadership and identified 8 interconnected and interactive tenets that define it. So the first hypothesis or principle is that when all are safe, respected, included, and their voices are heard, they're better able to learn and performance improves. If a student's worrying about being teased at recess for being too heavy or gay or for what they're wearing or where they live, it's really difficult for them to concentrate. If an adult is concerned about a supervisor's harsh words or an upcoming evaluation, they're unlikely to be able to focus on the task at hand. And we can assess these concerns as well as the outcome and the performance that results. And there's significant research that shows that this is true. The second principle balances the first. When schools focus on democratic inclusion and excellence, civil society also strengthens and advances. This principle emerges from the need for schools to focus not only on individual growth, but on democratic society. And we can certainly see the need for this in both the United States and the United Kingdom, where democracy has recently been challenged by polarization and global events. Then to support these 2 hypotheses, the 8 tenets are as follows. Accept a mandate for deep and equitable change. Deconstruct knowledge frameworks that perpetuate inequity, and of course, reconstruct them in more equitable ways. Address the inequitable distribution of power. Emphasize both individual and collective good. Focus on democracy, emancipation, equity, and justice. Emphasize interconnectedness, interdependence, and global awareness. Balance critique and promise. And exercise moral courage. And in the next very few minutes, we'll briefly talk about each of these tenets. The first, of course, is accept a mandate for deep and equitable change. That echoes many other theories for herself first. What guides you? What grounds you? What hill are you willing to die on? As Khalifa said, this requires critical reflection. We also have to critically reflect on our community context and on our organization. So if we're in a largely Indigenous school in Canada or in a Maori school in New Zealand, for example, we'd better learn about colonization and how colonization still inhibits the success of many Indigenous students, as well as what we should do about it. If we're leading a school in Africa, The greatest inequity might relate to gender, the lack of attendance and performance of girls. In an inner city school or an urban school, the issues may be myriad, ranging from racism to transphobia or xenophobia. So this tenet 1 requires us to identify the inequities we need to address in our context, determine where to start, and whether we have the moral courage to accept that mandate to do so. That's tenet 1. Now, before we go on, I want you again to use the chat to think of a student who's not succeeding and to jot down some of the reasons why, regardless of what level the student is at. A lack of time, maybe one reason why students aren't succeeding. Low self-worth. Different student experience, different lived realities. Responsibilities they have at home. Social dynamics. Fear of failure. Bullying, and so on. The issue is, whenever you ask people to do that, most of the responses have to do with the student or the family. And yet, we as educators need to figure out what we can do about it. What part of it is our responsibility? And that requires tenet 2, that we deconstruct knowledge frameworks that perpetuate inequity and reconstruct them in more equitable ways. We need to take seriously a poster that says, "Don't believe everything you think," because we've been taught to think about things in wrong ways sometimes. And so we need to also take seriously Johnson's finding that what separates successful leaders from unsuccessful ones is their mental models or meaning structures, not just their actions or their behaviors, because it's the meaning structures that guide behaviors. This tenet then also addresses racism and is anti-racist. It's anti-homophobic. It requires that we identify the sources of inequity, power, privilege, politics, class, race, ethnicity, sexual and gender identity, home language, religion, immigration status, ability, disability, and more. You know, I grew up in a Christian home that taught me that homosexuality was wrong. And that was years ago. But as I met people who've become some of my best friends who are gay, I decided that my God doesn't make mistakes, and I was wrong. And I had to deconstruct that framework and respect people's rights. And I know that many of us have engaged, without knowing it, in what is often called deficit thinking or implicit bias. We assume that those who are poor or Black or homeless have less ability or interest or motivation. We find ourselves talking about these children, or saying, as one teacher I interviewed once said, these students would be more successful if they had better parents. The tendency to blame the victim, to believe only if the child or the family or society were fixed, our job would be easier, is deficit thinking. And yet we need to take seriously The finding of Wagstaff and Fusarelli in 1998 that the most important factor in the academic achievement of minoritized children is the principal's explicit rejection of deficit thinking. We need to explicitly reject deficit thinking. The next tenet is to address the inequitable distribution of power. And you all know that power is not negative. I found that out 2 days ago when my power went off. We know how frustrating that is. But we can't exercise power over people. We need collegial relationships with teachers and parents and members of the community. Too often, we send newsletters home, we translate them into many languages, and we tell people what's happening at the school, what they need to do. But do we listen to them? We assume that our language is clear about what's intended. And I often think about the teacher who told me that he always had his class practice job interviews. And on that day, he told the students to wear their best clothes. And he admitted how surprised he was when his Latina students came dressed in huge flamenco-style skirts and embroidered blouses. He had failed to be specific and to recognize the implicit rules of power with which he was operating. Too often we fail to recognize the implicit power in our privilege and in our history that has perpetuated inequitable and often unconscionable beliefs and power about others. We could start with the papal bulls of the 15th century that perpetuated the doctrine of discovery and said that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited for Christian rulers. We're still living with the impact of these policies. Inappropriate use of power is not new, but it must constantly be understood and challenged. The fourth tenet is to emphasize both individual and collective good. We so often talk, and it's true, about the benefits for the individual of education. They get better salary, they find a better job, they have more prestige. But we need to recognize that education also serves a public good. It helps people understand one another, creates a stronger society. It works towards Judith Green's definition of a society of mutual benefit, of deep democracy. Think about it. If we stop with the definition of democracy as one person, one vote, the majority can always override the rights of the minority. And that's what has happened in many places for far too long. Tenets 5 and 6 are affirmative. Tenet 5 asks leaders to focus on democracy, emancipation, equity, and justice. It moves us from challenging our beliefs to looking at our practices. How do we act? We need to listen to people, not try and teach superficially about them, but to learn from them. What do we do when we hear a joke? I was in a school once when I heard of a student who told a joke. What's black and yellow and screams? The answer was a bus full of black children going over a cliff. It's awful. So I asked teachers, what would you say to students if they heard a joke like that? And one teacher said, well, I would ask students why they're telling a joke about hurting another. They're missing the point. What about the racism? Are we prepared to challenge it without disrespecting the perpetrator? What about teachable moments? I often think of one of my students with an Indian heritage who tried to raise a point in class about how Indian people might think about child labor in factories. And she said, I don't approve of child labor, but in India, some people think that having children take turns working in a factory for a year and providing food for the family is better than having them in school all the time and having the family starve. Her point was ignored, quickly dismissed. Tenet 6 goes further and reminds us that we live in an interconnected, interdependent society. I talked with my students just last week about a student born in Vietnam of a Vietnamese mother and an African-American father. His mother was told to throw him in the river. He was always an outcast, never going to school, never becoming literate. They found the story interesting, but they didn't connect it to being in a global village, to needing to teach global curiosity, and to recognize the interconnectedness of our world. How do we help students understand that what happens in the Ukraine or Pakistan or elsewhere affects us? How do we take advantage of the diversity in our classroom and learn from it? I think with shame of a bright girl in my 9th grade class years ago who said she came from Persia. I ignored that fact, and we as a class did nothing to learn from her. Tenet 7 requires that we balance critique and promise. It's not enough to identify what's inequitable. That's easy. We have to ensure there's promise for every member of our institution. Remember that promise is a noun, an adjective, and a verb. It requires commitment that we will do everything in our power to ensure equity for all. In fact, it does require educators to be advocates, allies, and sometimes activists if education is to be the great equalizer. And of course, the final tenet, exercise moral courage, really refers to all of the tenets. I watched television one recent morning, and the commentators were talking about the American midterm elections. They talked about how morality has been lost, how people don't care about the quality of a candidate, simply the politics. This is unacceptable for a transformative leader. We must be authentic and ensure there's congruency among our beliefs and our statements and our actions. We must recognize that when we strive for inclusion, equity, justice, and excellence, there's going to be pushback. Some people think they or their children will lose something. They'll have more competition. They say this erodes society. Transformative leaders, as Wiener states, must have one foot in the dominant structures of power and authority, as well as work to transform them. And this is uncomfortable and certainly requires moral courage. Let me tell you of a really small incident. In a 4th grade class that had been learning about biography, the teacher asked students to pick a biography and write a book report. And one child picked a book about Jackie Robinson, the first Black Major League Baseball player. Soon the teacher received a phone call. My husband will not allow a book about a Black man in the house. You have to give my son a different book. The teacher could have simply done so. And in the end, of course, the parent has to be right. But using her moral courage would require that she not simply accept the racism. She could ask the parents to come to the school, explain about what was happening in the assignment, explain why the child chose the book, and if they still wanted to change, make it the parent's duty to help the child choose a new book and not teacher. She doesn't have to accept or be party to the racism. And so moral courage can be found in both little acts as well as large ones. So I hope you can see why I support the theory of transformative leadership. It supports the inclusive, equitable, quality education required by the Sustainable Development Goal. It addresses the new VUCA world of vision, understanding, clarity, and agility. It's a comprehensive, normative, and complex theory that has an ethical grounding. It embeds values and attends to beliefs as well as actions. Transformative leadership is anti-racist, anti-homophobic. It addresses inequities, but it's also affirmative. It attends to cultures and histories, and it argues the need for global curiosity. Moreover, transformative leadership theory can guide practice anywhere, not simply in schools or higher education. It has been used in nonprofits, government agencies, private companies. It has guided the work of the charitable MasterCard Foundation in promoting education in underserved countries in Africa. It has been found to promote learning and higher education in Bolivia, and is the chosen theory of business writers and engineers. In the end, you may not select transformative leadership theory as your guidepost, but it's my hope that as you find your own grounding, you will choose a theory that addresses the needs of those in the most dire want. I'll stop here and end with the words of Wiener, who talked about the leadership of Paulo Freire as transformative, and asserted that as a transformative leader, Freire had to make sure he was not simply imposing his own ideological agenda on the community, but was instigating an alternative democratic project that was rooted in the ideals of liberty and freedom. This is what I hope I've begun in our brief time together. I've tried not to impose my ideas on you, but it's my hope that you will join me in Paulo Freire's project, rooted in ideals of liberty and freedom. And to do that, it's my hope that you will adopt a critical approach to leadership, that at the very least, you will now include in your leadership portfolio the theory of transformative leadership, and that you'll pick a theory that addresses beliefs and the need to change them, that's affirmative as well as critical, that addresses the UN Sustainable Development Goal 4 because it's grounded in the values of equity, inclusion, excellence, high quality education, and lifelong learning opportunities. My hope is that you will carefully consider transformative leadership theory. And I thank you and stand ready to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Let's have the questions, ladies and gentlemen.
Trevor?
Trevor,
Caroline, it's Trevor. I've been keeping quiet in the background. Very interesting. Good explanation of the difference between transformational and transformative. And you answered a lot of questions, but you finished an interesting point with Paulo Freire. And the words which I like from that perspective is the two words critical hope. And we defined that, was put it in a paper about 5-6 years ago now, talking about giving the people the agency, or the young people agency to choose how they want to behave, even if they don't currently choose it. Just wondered if you want to pick up on that point.
I really like the idea of critical hope. I think I used the term promise. We could have used hope. We could have used other words as well, I think. I think letting young people choose totally freely can cause problems. I think if the choice is embedded in specific values, if they understand those values of equity, respect, inclusion, valuing other people. Jerry Starrett talks about the need for absolute regard for other people. As long as we've inculcated those values, then I think we should allow young people to choose. But otherwise, I think we could end up in anarchy and chaos the way we often have in the US with the gun laws and the shootings. I don't know what you think about that. If you'd like to respond. Can't hear you, you're muted.
Sorry, I just put something in the chat about the concept of critical hope. I don't think it's liberty to give total freedom. It's about working with people to recognize, to provide them the opportunity to control their destiny. Now, many young people may decide they don't want to control their destiny, but it's given that opportunity. And we did this as a paper, looked at a particular school in a challenging area where they changed the whole community's expectations of schooling by giving that opportunity for young people to say what they valued and how it could be represented in their own curriculum. So I think, it's not just about anarchy and freedom, it's about giving them the opportunity to control their destiny. A lot of what you said to me was how can we reduce the barriers, but it doesn't actually place value into what these young people bring and the community they come from. It doesn't place values in them. And I think building on what they come from is, to me, fundamental in terms of we don't have a perfect world. Why do we keep saying let's try and change people or systems to conform that? Why do we recognize other people have different views?
Absolutely. And I thought I had made that really clear a couple of times. We can't try and teach superficially about people, but we have to listen to them and learn from them because they do bring value. They bring something very different from what we might know. And so I think you're absolutely right there. Thank you. Ken in the chat asks, how do I feel about private schools with specifically embedded values such as faith-based schools? I am concerned if those schools teach that they're right and everybody else is wrong. Michael Dantley has a wonderful article about faith-based leadership in which he differentiates between religion and spirituality and talks, and this picks up on Trevor's point, about faith meaning hope and hope for the future and hope for people to self-determine. But if faith-based schools teach that their doctrine and dogma is right as opposed to spirituality, which can play out in faith, but it also includes respect and hope and promise and liberation, as Michael Dantley talks about the hope that slaves had in their faith for something better, then I think we're in trouble. And so this notion of everybody bringing something of value is important. And if a faith-based or a private school teaches that, fine. If it doesn't, then I find it problematic. I don't know, Ken, if you want to respond to that before I go on to Sheila's comment, question. If not, I'll go on and you can decide. Sheila says, can I say something about how I might have influenced or changed people's minds to consider adopting this perspective? What's fascinating is that I try and use articles that make people think, like Michael Dantley's Faith-Based Leadership that differentiates between religion and spirituality. I use article, there's one we used the other night by Yazan, who's a Turkish Muslim who writes an autoethnography. I reuse an article by Kaula Murtada and David Watts, which talks about the wonderful African-American leadership of women in the Reconstruction and after period. And my students all say, why haven't we heard of this before? I talk clearly about racism, homophobia, xenophobia from day one. Last year, I had a class that was all Black. And so on day one, it was virtual. I said, it doesn't escape me that mine is the only white face on the screen. And we talked about racism openly. And I think being willing to do that seems really to have changed people's minds. My students often say partway through a course, you've changed the way I think, you've changed my life. It seems like that's an exaggeration. But I really think that being open and transparent and keeping that notion of equity in front of a class constantly in different ways. I have readings by Indigenous scholars. I had my class this year watch a video by Mary Berryman that was a keynote at the Belmas CCEAM conference in Liverpool last July. So they read articles by a variety of people, and that intersectionality that we talk about constantly seems to make a difference. I also have students, and I don't want to belabor this, but I also have students who say they've heard people talking about these kids, these students, but they've never heard the term deficit thinking. And I think teaching students some of the language and the importance of eliminating deficit thinking can really make a difference. I had a New Zealand colleague at one point, he started Te Kotaitanga, and he said, I heard you say once that quote of Wagstaff and Fusarelli, that the most important thing that makes a difference in minoritized student success is the explicit rejection of deficit thinking. He said, I didn't believe you, but I decided to try it. And he started this whole program that's gained national prominence that did improve the outcomes of Maori students. And so it just seems like constantly talking about it can really help people to consider the new approach. And I teach traditional leadership theory as well, as you probably guess, but I also teach them the difference and why I think we need a critical theory and one that focuses on the marginalized and the oppressed if we're going to make changes in our society. Somebody's asked me, and Penny, I don't know enough about what you are thinking about from bell hooks. So if you could say more, then I'd be able to respond perhaps.
Oh, sorry, Colin. Oh no, it's really lovely to see you. I would come on camera, but well, I will. Look, I've got my hat on because it's so cold here.
That's fine. I have my fire on in the background. I don't know if you can.
Exactly. I've been teaching with my hat on. It's hysterical. But yes, no, I'm a real fan of Paulo Freire and bell hooks, and I wondered if the relationship between the two, especially around transgressive learning, and then how that informs transformative leadership. I just wondered if you had a view. I like these heroes. You're now my hero.
I do think I sometimes quote bell hooks on this notion as well. I just chose to use Paulo Freire today, but I think they've all influenced the thinking. She writes about, I've forgotten what part of it I normally use, but it's the whole notion of race and transformation that is really important, I think. And so when I say I've read anything that ever uses the word transformative that I can find, which is why I get so frustrated when Google brings up transformational instead. But I think bell hooks is central to transformative leadership. I think Paulo Freire is, and there are certainly others who are as well. But you're absolutely right. There's lots of overlap. Allison says, what extent is it that modeled in universities that everyone brings something of value? I think it's not. I think you're absolutely right, Allison, that we have so many international students in our classes, and we expect them to do what we want them to do, to respond and write the way our national students do. And we don't make any effort to learn. Do that the other day. We have one Saudi Arabian Muslim man in our class, in our doctoral seminar, and he was missing last Monday night, 4 days ago. I hadn't checked my email in the afternoon. He wrote me saying he was sorry he couldn't be in class. He was in the hospital because his wife was having a baby. And so I wrote him back and I said, I hope things went all right. How was the baby? And he told me everything was fine and she'd had a baby boy. I'm trying to find the email right now if I can. And so I wrote back saying, tell me more. What was his name? And how much did he weigh? He then wrote me and said his name is Abdul Majid, which is a popular Arabic name that means prayer to God. And he added, there are 99 attributes in Islam. One of them is the name Majid. Abdul means the prayer. And so I sent that and a congratulations to the whole class as a very minor, simple example of how maybe we could begin to learn from him as well as he could learn from us. So I think we can do it really easily. I sometimes, that's one reason why I asked him, even though he wasn't in class, to comment in a discussion board on the article by Yazan, who was a Muslim, because I want to know exactly what he feels about the article, and I want students to learn from him as well. But I think it's taken me a while to come to that perspective. I used to kind of ignore people who didn't speak fluent English and who didn't answer very well. And I think you're absolutely right that universities don't do a good job of it at all, and we need to. Where are we? Oh, Gulnur asks, how important is sustainable professional development? Absolutely important. The Bieneman I talked about earlier, who has done a lot of research in her own school as a principal about transformative leadership and how to be equitable and inclusive of all, said that 1 year after she'd done this for about 3 years, achievement started to decline again. And she suddenly realized she'd done a whole lot of professional development for a couple of years, and then there'd been staff turnover, and she hadn't done any more. And so I think not only in districts and schools and for staff development at universities, it can't just be that we talk about equity and social justice and inclusion in one course. I think it has to be in every course. We're trying hard to do that, but it's not being very successful. And so I think this notion of sustainable professional development relates to that sustainable development goal of ongoing professional development and learning. It's not just for students in developing countries or underrepresented students, it's for all of us all the time. I think that's a really important point. Thank you, Gulnur. I'm picking up on Trevor's comment of critical hope that he made before. I think what I hope transformative leadership does is give us some ways of implementing critical hope. The notion of creating a safe, inclusive, respectful learning environment, for instance, is one way to give them critical hope. Equalizing power distribution would be another way. So I think it's absolutely an important concept. You want to say more?
No, I was just going to give my apology and say I've got to go now. It's great to see you again, Carolyn. So look after yourself, and I'm sure we'll touch base someday along the way. But thanks for this evening. Okay, take care.
Thank you so much. Alison, comment or question?
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, so it was a comment. It was really picking up on my comment, and thank you. It's been a really interesting session, and it just occurs to me the whole role modelling aspect that I was so not just with students but with staff, and I mean all kinds of diversity, and I speak from personal experience as a parent carer and people with health conditions, and sort of like from a university perspective, yes, we'll be accommodating, and yes, we'll respect difference, but we'll judge you by how many papers you produce and how many funding bids you get in the way that you could do if your life was this kind of life in this kind of box. And I think until we have that kind of role modeling that actually people could be valued for what they bring, that might not be a conventional academic metric, then I think it's going to be a long, old struggle to try and spread that any wider and bigger and deeper, unless at the heart of our universities we start to really step back and think about people in all their shapes, sizes and personal circumstances, and obviously there's a race element, but way beyond, you know, in all sorts of ways. If you don't fit that stereotypical way of being able to perform that meets those markers, then really your hopes of an academic career are fairly thin in the current context. And I think until we get that bit sorted, it's going to be really hard to ripple that out beyond.
I think you're really right. I noticed earlier when I asked you to think about a student who wasn't succeeding, one of the things Ken wrote was maybe they're in courses that don't match their goals. And we do that. We have requirements that have nothing to do with the goals or the outcomes of courses. We have promotion and tenure requirements that don't allow faculty to become activists engaged with the people they're working about and writing about. I mean, there's so many things that we need to change. You're absolutely right. I think you're I think you're right on that, you know, there's a lot of work to do, but I do think that there's hope, and we have to have hope. You know, that's the other side of it. If we lose hope and optimism, then I don't know where we go. And so back to Michael Dantley's notion of faith, that he talks about it, how it gives us the hope, that we have faith in something, in the people we work with, in something that provides us hope. And I think that's really important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Penny, what? I think the education system in England, as I understand it, tends to be pretty technical. That there's a lot of the inspectorate, for example, that I remember saying to somebody recently, I wonder why we still have inspections. And I'm looking at I have a mantle in the background. But we've got to do more, and that's why I keep going back to that notion of beliefs, that it isn't technical skills and strategies that makes a difference for leaders, it's beliefs. And I don't think the British system has taken at all seriously the need to focus on beliefs and things like implicit bias, racism, homophobia, any of those things. When I go to a British conference, I hardly ever hear mention of it. I heard one session at the Belmas CCEAM conference about how few Black leaders there'd been and how few Black professors. And until that changes, it seems to me that we're limiting our futures. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, if we do not have any more comments or questions, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you so much, Carolyn, for the very inspiring talk that you have shared with us, and also the questions that you have answered, the things, the perspectives that you have had shared with us. It was indeed a very eye-opening session for me as well, from over this side of the world. We hope to hear more in other sessions after this from other colleagues from BERA as well as from CCEAM.
Thank you all for coming, for listening, for your questions. I've really enjoyed the interaction. Feel free to leave when you have to. Thank you so much.